Hi, I'm Benjamin Baxter, author of In the Original Text It Says, Word Study Fallacies and How to Avoid Them. In this video, I'm going to talk about what's wrong with what scholars and pastors typically do with biblical words. There's two broad approaches to word meaning that we can describe as maximalist and minimalist. A maximalist position says that words bring a lot of information or meaning with them, and the minimalist position says that words bring a small amount of information with them. The maximalist position is the traditional position that is typified by the recommended Bible study method of finding a word in the biblical text which has theological meaning or is seen as having theological meaning, and then finding other passages that also have theological significance that share that same word. So, for example, if we take the Greek word agapao, to love, we might look at passages like Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, which says, "And walk in love as Christ loved, agapao us, and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And then we might look up Luke chapter 6, verse 35, which says, "But love, agapao, your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil." And so then we would take passages like this, which have the word agapao, and define agapao as something like acts of intentional, self-sacrificial love. This is something which in my book is called swamp water, where we take a bunch of different passages and use the context of those passages and the message conveyed in those passages to define a word. Similar to this would be looking up a biblical word in a lexicon, finding various meanings of that word, and using those various uses of the word to describe what it means. One problem with this maximalist view is that words and concepts then become confused. And we start to think that they're the same thing. And we start to think that the significance of Christianity is found in words rather than in the sentences, the paragraphs, the texts in which those words are used. The love of God is not best described with agapao, as if that word means something significant on its own, but in how God shows us love. For example, in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, how do we know God loves us? We know God loves us because while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So then when we see agapao used to describe the selfish love of the Pharisees in Luke 11, verse 43, who loved the best seats in the synagogues, or we see agapao used to describe the selfish love of Balaam in 2 Peter 2:15, who loved gain from wrongdoing, our faith does not need to be shaken just because our view of agapao needs to change. That's what needs to be shaken, our view of agapao, not our view of God's love for us. Because biblical truth is found in sentences, in paragraphs, in books, not in individual words. A maximalist approach takes these words that have been loaded with theological meaning and then imposes that theological meaning into other passages, and that prevents us from understanding each verse and passage within its own context. The importance of context for word meaning is obvious if you think about instructions that you might get, that you might buy. It's instructions you might get with something you buy at the store that were obviously translated into English. And often if you read those instructions, the words seem close. They seem almost right, but they're just not quite the right words to use in that context or in that combination of words. When pastors and scholars take these biblical words and impose them with theological meaning derived from a variety of contexts and saying that all of that theological meaning is what this word means, and then imposing it on other passages, that's kind of along the same lines as those translations that we read in things that we buy. On the other hand, what we might call a linguistically sensitive approach is the minimalist approach. Words have a small amount of meaning, a small amount of information, and they're not particularly significant on their own. Their significance is how they're combined with other words to create sentences and longer texts. The context is so important that context can be said to control word meaning. This means you can't just look up a word in isolation and think you now understand the passage correctly. You need to see how the word is connected with other words and how that word is used in particular grammatical structures to understand them correctly. This requires an ability to read and analyze those grammatical structures in their own languages. So in other words, I would suggest either learning the biblical languages well enough to read and analyze texts within their or with their grammatical structures, or stick with English. In another video, I'll talk about what you can do in English to benefit from the expertise of scholars who can read and analyze the Bible in its original languages.